The wind sliced through the barren landscape like a blade forged from pure ice. -45 degrees Celsius. That's cold enough to freeze exposed skin in under 5 minutes, to turn breath into crystals before it leaves your mouth, to make every step outside feel like walking into a wall of knives. At this temperature, metal becomes brittle enough to shatter, rubber cracks like glass, and any moisture in the air transforms into tiny ice needles that hang suspended in the atmosphere, creating an eerie, shimmering fog. Modern survival experts would call these conditions unsurvivable without advanced gear. The Indigenous peoples of Canada's far north called it Tuesday. Picture this. No Gore-Tex jackets with their miracle synthetic fibers, no insulated boots from REI designed in temperature-controlled laboratories, no propane heaters humming reliably in the corner of a prefabricated shelter, no emergency satellite phones to call for rescue when things go wrong, no supply drops from helicopters, no weather apps warning you that conditions are deteriorating. Just you, your family, and a landscape so hostile that even the trees gave up trying to grow tall, their stunted forms barely reaching above the snowline, twisted by winds that howl for days without pause. Now imagine not just surviving, but thriving, building communities that lasted generations, raising children who grew strong and capable, creating art, music, stories, and traditions, developing complex social structures and trading networks that spanned thousands of kilometers. That's exactly what the Inuit, Dani, Cree, and other Indigenous nations did for thousands of years across the northern reaches of Canada, from the Arctic tundra, where the land meets frozen ocean, to the subarctic forests, where winter darkness swallows the world for months at a time. The winter of 1923 brought one of the harshest cold snaps ever recorded in the Northern Territories. Temperatures plummeted to -52 degrees Celsius in some regions, shattering records that had stood for decades. The Hudson's Bay Company recorded that ink froze in their pens inside heated buildings. Supply lines to remote settlements froze solid, with rivers becoming impassable highways of ice and snow, accumulating to depths that buried entire structures. Modern equipment of the era failed spectacularly. Steam engines seized, their water turning to ice faster than fires could keep it liquid. Metal tools shattered when struck. Petroleum products thickened into useless sludge. Yet Indigenous communities who maintained their traditional knowledge weathered the storm with a resilience that baffled outside observers, who had assumed technological superiority. They had something technology couldn't replicate. Generations upon generations of accumulated wisdom about reading the land, understanding the cold's behavior, respecting its power, and working with nature's rhythms instead of against them. Sarah Mukpa, an elder from a Dean community near Great Slave Lake, remembers her grandmother's stories about that winter with the clarity that comes from tales told and retold around fires through the decades. She said the white settlers were burning through their coal supplies in days, panicking when the shipments stopped coming because the railways couldn't function. They rationed fuel, wore every piece of clothing they owned layered on their bodies, and still shivered uncontrollably in their wooden houses. Meanwhile, our people barely changed their routine. We knew how to find warmth where others saw only ice. We understood that the cold wasn't an enemy to be fought with brute force, but a reality to be accommodated through knowledge and preparation. Her words carried no boast, just the quiet confidence of inherited knowledge tested across centuries, knowledge that had kept her ancestors alive when others perished. The secret wasn't one technique or one clever trick that could be learned in an afternoon workshop. It was a complete integrated system of survival, refined over millennia through trial and error, through successes that were celebrated and failures that were mourned and learned from. A system where every action connected to the next, where waste didn't exist because every scrap of material had value and purpose, and where respect for the environment meant understanding its rhythms so deeply that you could predict which day the caribou would migrate through a particular valley, or when the ice would be thick enough to bear the weight of hunters crossing to new territory. It was knowledge encoded in language, in stories, in the muscle memory of tasks performed since childhood, in the layout of camps and the design of tools that looked simple but embodied sophisticated understanding of physics, materials, and environmental conditions. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel, because understanding how our ancestors conquered the impossible will fundamentally change how you see both the past and your own potential. The stories ahead aren't just history lessons about people who lived long ago in conditions we'll never face. They're a masterclass in human ingenuity, adaptability, and resilience that modern society desperately needs to remember as we face our own environmental challenges and rediscover that technology alone isn't always the answer. When the temperature drops to -40, shelter isn't just shelter anymore. It transforms from a simple structure into a precisely engineered life support system. It becomes the difference between waking up tomorrow with frost on your eyelashes but alive, and becoming another frozen story whispered around distant fires, a cautionary tale of what happens when knowledge fails. The Indigenous peoples of Canada's north understood this with a precision and depth that would impress modern mechanical engineers and architects. They built homes that could maintain interior temperatures 30 to 40 degrees warmer than outside, without any external heat source beyond body warmth, and small, carefully managed fires that consumed minimal fuel. This wasn't luck or accident. This was applied physics and material science developed through observation and refinement across countless generations. The igloo stands as perhaps the most ingenious cold-weather shelter ever designed by human hands. A structure so elegant in its simplicity, yet so sophisticated in its execution, that it continues to inspire modern architects working on sustainable housing. Constructed from compacted snow blocks cut in precise spirals, these domes utilize the insulating properties of trapped air within the snow's crystalline structure. But here's what most people miss, what the tourist photographs and elementary school projects don't capture. An igloo isn't just a pile of snow shaped like a dome. Each block is cut at a specific angle, carefully calculated not with instruments, but with knowledge passed down and refined. The blocks create a catenary arch that distributes weight evenly across the structure, preventing collapse even under the crushing weight of heavy storms that deposit additional snow on top. The entrance tunnel always faces away from prevailing winds and sits lower than the main floor, creating a cold air trap that keeps frigid air from flowing into the living space, allowing the warmer air to rise and remain in the dome where people sleep and live. Thomas Amagwalik, an Inuit builder from Nunavut, learned igloo construction from his father, who learned from his father before him in an unbroken chain of knowledge stretching back into time beyond memory. People think it's simple. Cut some snow, stack it in a circle, done. But there's mathematics in every cut, geometry in every placement, he explained, while demonstrating the technique to a group of researchers who had come with measuring instruments and thermometers, trying to understand what generations of Inuit had known intuitively. The angle of each block, the tilt inward as you spiral up, the size of the keystone at the top that locks everything together, get any of it wrong, and you either can't complete the structure or it collapses the first time wind hits it. I've seen builders from outside try with written instructions and diagrams. They fail because they're thinking, not feeling. You have to understand how snow behaves, how it compresses under the knife, how blocks seat against each other. He could build a shelter large enough for 6 people in under 2 hours, working with nothing but a snow knife carved from bone or antler, his bare hands that moved with practiced efficiency, and knowledge passed down through countless generations who had perfected the art of turning frozen water into livable space. Inside, platforms made of snow and covered with caribou or seal hides created elevated sleeping areas, keeping occupants off the coldest layer of air that naturally settled at floor level. The platforms were positioned at precise heights, usually about ½ a meter up, creating zones of different temperatures within the igloo. The coldest air sank to the entrance and the floor. The warmest air rose to the dome's peak, where a small ventilation hole prevented dangerous carbon dioxide buildup. The middle zone, where people sat and slept, maintained the most comfortable temperature. Small soapstone lamps called quillik burned seal oil, providing both light and supplementary warmth, while also serving as cooking surfaces where frozen meat could be thawed and water melted from ice. The heat from these lamps, combined with body heat from multiple occupants, could raise interior temperatures to a comfortable 5 to 15 degrees Celsius, even when outside conditions reached deadly extremes of -40 or colder. Women tended these lamps with extraordinary skill, adjusting the wick made from Arctic cotton or moss and controlling the fuel flow to maintain consistent heat without producing excessive smoke that would make the space unlivable or consuming precious oil reserves that represented the difference between survival and starvation during the long, dark months. But igloos weren't the only answer, because the North is vast and diverse, encompassing different ecosystems that demanded different solutions. In the subarctic forests where the Dini and Cree nations made their homes, snow depths and forest cover created different possibilities and different challenges. Here, semi-subterranean winter lodges dug partially into the earth took advantage of ground insulation, using the earth itself as thermal mass. The soil itself, frozen hard on the surface but retaining some residual heat deeper down, provided a thermal buffer against the killing cold of the air. Walls were constructed from stacked logs, carefully selected for straightness and fit, chinked with moss and clay mixed with animal fat to create an airtight seal, then banked with snow on the exterior that added another insulating layer. Multiple layers created dead air spaces between the logs, the chinking, and the snowbank. Nature's most effective insulation that modern builders have only recently rediscovered with names like thermal breaks and vapor barriers. The conical structure of certain winter lodges wasn't arbitrary aesthetics or cultural preference without practical purpose. The shape minimized surface area relative to interior volume, reducing heat loss through basic geometry. A sphere has the best ratio, but spheres are hard to build with straight logs, so cones became the practical compromise. The steep angle of the walls prevented snow accumulation that could collapse the roof under accumulated weight during heavy storms. Smoke holes at the apex could be covered with hide flaps during the worst storms, while the fire below was damped but never extinguished completely, maintaining a coal bed that could be quickly revived when the storm passed. Sarah's grandmother taught her about these lodges during long winter evenings. You keep the fire small and efficient. Big fires are for people who don't understand cold, who think heat is about size. Small fires maintained constantly, fed with the right wood selected for how it burns, that's wisdom. That's knowledge. A small fire kept going for 3 months outlasts a bonfire that consumes your woodpile in 3 weeks. Ventilation presented a crucial challenge that could kill as surely as cold if solved incorrectly. Seal a dwelling too tightly, and carbon monoxide from fires or oil lamps could kill you in your sleep, a silent death that claimed victims who never woke. Leave it too open and you'd freeze, or the wind would extinguish your carefully maintained fire. Indigenous builders solved this through carefully positioned air gaps and the use of materials that allowed moisture to escape while retaining heat, what modern engineers call breathability. Ice would form on interior walls, thin sheets of crystalline water, but this was actually beneficial rather than a problem to be solved. The ice created an additional insulating layer while preventing the snow blocks themselves from melting and weakening the structure's integrity. Builders understood this counterintuitive fact. A properly functioning igloo has ice on the inside. Communities didn't rely on single structures either, because redundancy means survival when conditions can change from manageable to lethal in hours. Winter camps typically consisted of multiple interconnected shelters, sometimes with snow tunnels linking them, so people could move between dwellings without exposing themselves to killing temperatures that could cause frostbite during the brief journey from one structure to another. This wasn't just convenience for lazy mornings, it was survival strategy thought through to its logical conclusion. If someone became injured or ill, help was accessible without deadly exposure. If a shelter failed structurally, alternatives existed immediately. If fire went out in one space, others could provide embers to restart it. If food was stored in one location, it remained accessible even during storms that made outdoor movement impossible. The sophistication extended to site selection, the first and perhaps most important decision when establishing a winter camp. Communities chose locations with natural windbreaks, hills or rock formations that blocked the worst of the prevailing winds. Proximity to water sources that wouldn't freeze completely meant ice fishing remained possible, and water for drinking didn't require melting massive quantities of snow, a process that consumes enormous amounts of fuel. Access to materials needed for construction and fuel meant sustainability. You couldn't camp where you'd exhaust resources in days. They rid terrain the way modern meteorologists read satellite data and computer models, understanding through accumulated observation how wind patterns flowed across hills, where snow would drift deep and where it would compact into the ideal density for building. They knew which slopes got sun exposure that could raise temperatures by a few precious degrees, and which valleys became cold traps where air stagnated and temperatures plummeted. If shelter was the first line of defense against the environment's hostility, clothing was the intimate armor that made movement and active life possible in conditions that would kill an exposed human in minutes. The indigenous peoples of northern Canada developed garment systems so effective that modern Arctic expeditions still study and adapt their designs, often concluding that traditional methods outperform cutting-edge synthetic materials in extreme conditions. This wasn't fashion in any sense modern culture would recognize. This was engineering wrapped intimately around the human body, creating a microclimate that preserved life while allowing the flexibility and mobility necessary for hunting, gathering, and daily survival tasks. The fundamental principle was layering, but not the way most modern people understand it, when they pull on a fleece and a jacket and call it good. This was sophisticated, systematic layering where each component served specific functions, and the interactions between layers mattered as much as the layers themselves. The innermost layer worn directly against skin was made from soft, pliable caribou hide, with the fur turned inward, creating an air-trapping insulation layer that felt soft against the body, while allowing moisture from perspiration to move outward through the hide. This moisture management was critical. Wet skin loses heat 25 times faster than dry skin, and in -40 conditions, wet skin means death. The next layer reversed the fur orientation, with hide facing inward and fur facing outward, creating a barrier against wind while still permitting breathability. Outer garments often incorporated different fur types, strategically placed where their specific properties mattered most. Wolverine around hood edges, because its unique hollow hair structure means frost doesn't accumulate from frozen breath, seal, or caribou for the main body, depending on whether water resistance or lightweight insulation was more important, and Arctic fox for extreme insulation in critical areas where heat loss concentrated. Emma Kuptana, a traditional seamstress from Inuvik, learned the art from her mother who learned from her mother, in a line of women stretching back through time, each adding refinements and passing on hard-won knowledge. She now teaches younger generations who grew up buying mass-produced parkas from catalogs, trying to reconnect them with knowledge their great-grandmothers possessed. Every stitch matters, not just for durability, though a failed seam in a blizzard can kill you, but for how air moves through the garment, she explained, while working on a parka, her needle moving with practiced rhythm that made the work look effortless, though it required intense concentration and skill. See how I'm spacing these stitches? Too tight and moisture can't escape. You sweat from exertion, it freezes, and that ice layer against your skin will kill you faster than the wind ever could. Too loose and cold air penetrates through the gaps. The spacing, the thread tension, the angle of the needle as it goes through the hide, it's all calculated, even if we don't call it mathematics or physics. We call it doing it right, the way it's always been done, because the old ones figured it out through trial and error and remembering what worked. The thread itself mattered enormously. Sinew from caribou or other animals provided thread that was strong, naturally waterproof when it absorbed moisture, and swelled slightly to seal the holes it created, and wouldn't rot or weaken over time. Modern synthetic thread might be stronger initially, but it can fail in extreme cold, becoming brittle and snapping under stress. The tools mattered too, needles made from bone or later metal, awls for punching holes in thick hide, specialized cutting tools that allowed precise shaping of materials that froze stiff in winter air. Mittens, not gloves, were universal in extreme cold, and this wasn't arbitrary preference. Keeping fingers together allowed them to share warmth, maintaining circulation and dexterity far better than separated fingers that each fought their own losing battle against the cold. Mittens could be made larger with more insulation, without sacrificing dexterity, as much as insulated gloves would, because the whole hand moved as one unit, rather than requiring individual finger mobility. But indigenous designs went far beyond simple mittens. Double-layer mittens with an outer shell made from wind-resistant seal or caribou hide, and an inner liner of soft fur, connected by a cord running through the coat sleeves so they couldn't be lost in a storm or while handling equipment, and often with thumbless inner mittens that allowed hands to be withdrawn entirely into the coat body for warming without removing the outer layer. This meant that during extended periods outside, hands could be warmed periodically without the desperate fumbling of trying to put frozen fingers back into mittens in wind that made every second of exposure agonizing. Footwear represented perhaps the most critical challenge in the entire clothing system, because feet are furthest from the body's core heat, in constant contact with frozen ground and subject to the moisture problem in its most extreme form. Feet sweat even in extreme cold, producing moisture that has nowhere to go but into whatever surrounds them. Traditional mukluk solved this through a brilliant multi-layer system that managed moisture while providing insulation and protection. An inner sock of soft hide fit snugly against the foot. Over this went a layer of dried grass or moss, carefully prepared and stored, that served dual purposes: insulation that trapped air in its fibrous structure and moisture absorption that pulled sweat away from the skin. The outer mukluk, made from caribou leg hide or seal skin with the fur facing outward, provided the waterproof barrier and additional insulation. The grass or moss would be changed daily when possible, dried by the fire while a second set was in use, creating a rotation system that kept feet consistently dry. This rotation meant you needed to prepare enough grass or moss for the entire winter during the brief summer months when these materials were available, planning and preparation that spanned seasons. The sole was made from durable materials like sealskin or the particularly tough hide from caribou legs, areas that had evolved to withstand constant wear. Treads were created through careful stitching patterns that provided grip on ice, and some communities added pieces of bone or later metal to create cleats for particularly icy conditions. The mukluk extended high up the leg, sometimes to the knee, preventing snow from entering and creating another insulating air gap between the mukluk top and the outer clothing layer. Elder Joseph Karatak demonstrated the difference this made during a gathering where government officials had come to discuss housing policy, trying to convince communities to abandon their traditional seasonal movements. I watched those officials arrive in the 1960s with their modern winter boots that they'd bought from catalogs, rubber and insulation, and factory-made precision, expensive boots that were supposed to be the best available. Within 2 hours of walking outside, inspecting our community, their feet were frozen because the boots didn't breathe. Their own sweat turned to ice inside those rubber prisons. They had to go inside repeatedly to warm up, hobbling and complaining. My mukluks. I could walk all day in -50 and my feet stayed dry and warm. I could run if I needed to, climb over ice ridges, kneel in snow while checking a trap line. They looked at us like we were primitive, like our traditional ways were backwards. We looked at them like they were fools who'd forgotten everything their own ancestors once knew. The genius extended to how garments could be adjusted dynamically for activity level, because the human body's heat production varies enormously between rest and exertion. Parkas featured drawstrings and ventilation flaps that could be opened during hard exertion to prevent overheating and sweating, then sealed again during rest or when wind picked up. This dynamic regulation meant the same garment system worked whether you were sitting motionless for hours while ice fishing, waiting for the subtle pull that indicated a fish had taken the bait, or engaged in the intense effort of tracking game across broken terrain, climbing over pressure ridges in sea ice, or hauling a seal carcass back to camp. Hoods were designed with careful attention to peripheral vision and hearing because situational awareness meant survival. A hood that blocked side vision could mean not seeing a polar bear approaching or missing the signs of changing weather, but a hood that didn't protect the face meant frostbite. The compromise was adjustable hoods with fur ruffs that created a warm air pocket around the face while allowing the wearer to look around, hear approaching dangers, and communicate with companions. For this next part, I need you to do something important. Think about someone you know who could benefit from understanding what true resilience looks like. Someone who needs to remember that humans are capable of far more than modern comfort has led us to believe. Someone struggling with challenges who needs to see examples of humans overcoming obstacles that make today's problems look manageable. Then scroll down right now and leave a comment saying, "Our ancestors were engineers of survival." Do it. That phrase deserves to be seen, and it helps this channel reach more people who need these stories. Knowledge of clothing and shelter meant nothing without understanding the environment intimately enough to predict its moods, locate its resources, and move through it safely without becoming another victim of its indifference. This wasn't wilderness survival in the modern sense, a desperate, improvised struggle against nature by someone who doesn't belong there. This was fluency in the language of ice, wind, snow, and the life that persisted in seeming lifelessness. This was being native to a place in the deepest sense, where the land wasn't an adversary, but a complex system you understood, because your survival and your ancestors' survival depended on that understanding. Ice reading was a skill developed from early childhood, absorbed through observation and instruction until it became instinctive. Not all ice is equal, a fact that kills those who don't understand it. Sea ice moves, breathes, shifts with currents and tides, creating pressure ridges where plates collide and leads of open water where they separate. It can look solid from a distance and be deadly thin underneath a dusting of snow. Freshwater ice in lakes and rivers behaves differently depending on depth, current speed, temperature fluctuations, and even which direction the wind has been blowing. The color of ice tells stories to those who learn to read them. Clear blue ice is solid and trustworthy, formed gradually and frozen to significant depth. White ice contains air pockets and may be weaker, though sometimes it's simply surface conditions. Gray ice is melting or contains water, utterly unreliable and deadly. The sound ice makes under pressure reveals its thickness and integrity. A solid thunk means safety, while creaking or cracking means danger. Indigenous hunters could determine whether ice would support their weight by reading these signs from dozens of meters away, a skill that saved countless lives in conditions where one wrong step meant plunging into water that would kill through cold shock in minutes, even if you could climb back out. Weather prediction didn't rely on satellite data, computer models, or meteorological instruments measuring barometric pressure and humidity. It came from reading clouds in their infinite variations, wind patterns and how they shifted throughout the day, animal behavior that changed in response to pressure systems humans couldn't feel directly, and subtle changes in air pressure and humidity that modern people have lost the ability to perceive, because they've never had to develop that sensitivity. Margaret Anotalik, a knowledge keeper from Kugluktuk, described her grandfather's abilities with a mix of pride and sadness that such knowledge was becoming rare. He could tell you 3 days in advance when a storm was coming, how severe it would be, from which direction, and approximately when it would arrive. He watched how the dogs behaved, whether they were restless or lethargic, how their fur stood up or lay flat. He watched how the ravens flew, whether they stayed near camp or ranged far, how they called to each other. He paid attention to the way snow crystals formed on surfaces, their size and shape and the patterns they made. He said the land speaks constantly to those who remember how to listen, but most people have gone deaf. Government weather reports would say clear skies and good conditions, and he'd prepare the camp for blizzards, bringing in extra firewood, securing shelters, making sure nothing would blow away. He was always right. Not sometimes, not usually. Always. Navigation in whiteout conditions or during the months of polar darkness required skills that seem almost supernatural to modern observers who rely on GPS and maps. The indigenous peoples of the north used wind direction, memorizing the prevailing patterns for each season and location. They used the feel of snowdrifts shaped by those prevailing winds, running their hands along the ridges to determine direction even when visibility dropped to zero. They used star positions when visible, having memorized the wheel of the sky and how it turned through the seasons. They used an extraordinary spatial memory that mapped the land in 3 dimensions, remembering not just where places were, but what they looked like from different approaches, which hills blocked which views, where rivers ran even when buried under snow. They could dead reckon across featureless terrain and arrive precisely where intended, a feat that modern GPS has made unnecessary, but that GPS's fragility in extreme cold, batteries dying rapidly, satellites blocked by terrain or weather, made less reliable than human memory and skill. Resource location knowledge represented generations of accumulated observation condensed into practical wisdom. Which plants remained accessible under snow and provided food or medicine when nothing else was available? Where caribou migration routes would pass based on season and current weather patterns, Because while the general routes remained consistent, specific paths shifted based on snow conditions and forage availability. Which lakes held fish, even in deep winter, and more importantly, where in those lakes the fish would concentrate based on underwater structure and oxygen levels. How to find seal breathing holes in sea ice by reading surface conditions and understanding seal behavior. Where to locate the right type of snow for igloo construction. Not too powdery, not too hard, compressed enough to cut cleanly, but not icy. This wasn't guesswork or luck. It was systematic environmental knowledge applied with scientific precision, tested constantly against results, refined when it failed. Fire-making in extreme cold presented challenges that would defeat most modern campers within minutes of trying. Wood becomes brittle at -40, hard to ignite because the cold sucks heat from flames before combustion can sustain itself. Metal tools can shatter from thermal stress. Hands lose dexterity rapidly, making fine motor control nearly impossible. But traditional methods using bow drills that generated friction heat or flint and steel that created sparks, combined with carefully prepared tinder bundles, allowed indigenous peoples to create fire reliably even in the worst conditions. The tinder itself was often prepared in advance during summer, dried fungus that caught sparks easily, birch bark shavings that burned intensely even when damp, plant fibers mixed with animal fat that created sustained flame from a single ignition. These materials were stored in waterproof containers made from birch bark or hide and kept close to the body to prevent them from freezing solid, because frozen tinder doesn't ignite. But perhaps most crucial was the knowledge of limits, the wisdom to know when to push forward and when to stop, understanding when conditions were too severe for travel, no matter how urgent the need, recognizing signs of frostbite in yourself or others before permanent damage occurred. The waxy white appearance of skin, the loss of feeling that meant tissues were literally freezing, knowing the progressive stages of hypothermia and what to do at each stage, understanding when to conserve energy rather than push forward in exhaustion that would lead to mistakes. This wasn't weakness or cowardice, it was intelligence. Survival required not just endurance and skill but judgment, the wisdom to distinguish between possible and suicidal, between calculated risk and pointless death. Young hunters spent years learning these skills before being allowed to venture out alone or make critical decisions that affected others. The margin for error was zero, and ignorance was a death sentence not just for the individual, but potentially for those depending on them. Stories of those who died from mistakes became teaching tools, recounted not to frighten but to inform, each tragedy holding lessons that might save future lives. Don't trust ice near river mouths where current keeps it thin. Always carry backup supplies. Never separate from your partner in poor visibility. Respect the weather's warnings. Turn back when conditions deteriorate, rather than pushing forward in hope. These lessons were encoded in stories that made them memorable, passed down through generations, each telling reinforcing the knowledge that kept people alive. Individual skill, no matter how exceptional, meant little without the collective intelligence and cooperation of the community working as an integrated unit. Survival in extreme environments requires social structures as sophisticated as any technology, networks of mutual obligation and support that function even under extreme stress. The Indigenous peoples of northern Canada built societies that distributed labor, knowledge, and resources with extraordinary efficiency, creating resilience through cooperation that no individual could achieve alone. The sharing economy wasn't political ideology debated in councils or imposed from above. It was practical necessity that emerged naturally from environmental conditions where individual success was unpredictable, but collective success over time was achievable. A successful hunt might yield more meat than one family could process or store before it spoiled even in freezing conditions. But preserved and distributed throughout the community, it sustained everyone through lean periods. This wasn't charity or generosity in the modern sense, it was insurance investment in social capital. The hunter who shared generously today when their hunt succeeded would receive the same when their hunt failed tomorrow, when injury prevented them from hunting, when weather kept everyone inside for weeks. Reciprocity networks extended across family groups, and even between communities separated by hundreds of kilometers. creating safety nets that buffered against the environment's unpredictability. If one camp faced starvation, others could provide support. If one community's hunting grounds failed, they could relocate to allied territories. These networks were formalized through kinship ties, marriages that created obligations between groups, and trading relationships that went far beyond mere exchange of goods. Knowledge transfer followed formalized patterns that modern education systems struggle to replicate. Elders held accumulated wisdom about weather patterns spanning decades, animal behavior across seasons and conditions, seasonal changes and what they meant, survival techniques refined through personal experience and inherited from those before them. They taught through stories that encoded practical information in memorable narrative form, through demonstration that allowed learners to see techniques in action, and through supervised practice where mistakes could be corrected before they became fatal. Children weren't coddled or protected from reality. They were prepared systematically for the world they'd inhabit as adults. By age 7 or 8, most could contribute meaningfully to camp tasks like ice fishing, setting snares for small game, or processing hides and meat. By their teens, they possessed skills that would take modern survival experts decades of study and practice to acquire, if they ever acquired them at all. Gender roles, while often distinct in their focus, were complementary and equally valued in functioning communities. Men typically focused on hunting large game and building major structures, activities requiring extended periods away from camp and high-risk decision-making in dangerous conditions. Women maintained the home, processed food and materials in ways that required extensive knowledge and skill, created clothing through techniques that took years to master, and tended fires and lamps that kept everyone alive. But these divisions weren't absolute or rigid. Women hunted when necessary, when male hunters were injured, when opportunities presented themselves near camp, when small game could be taken while performing other tasks. Men sewed when needed, especially when traveling far from camp where damaged clothing could mean death. Flexibility ensured survival when circumstances demanded adaptation beyond normal patterns. The division of labor was about efficiency and specialization, not rigid hierarchies of value. Decision-making in traditional communities often operated through consensus among elders and experienced hunters rather than autocratic authority vested in a single chief or leader. This made profound sense in environments where a single bad decision could kill everyone in the group. Multiple perspectives, shared experience and collective wisdom produced better outcomes than individual judgment, no matter how experienced that individual might be. When to move camp because resources were depleting or better opportunities existed elsewhere. Whether to attempt a hunt in marginal weather conditions. How to allocate stored resources through the winter months. These decisions were too important for one person to make alone. Discussion continued until consensus emerged, or until the best path forward became clear through dialogue and the weighing of factors. The concept of community extended to the elderly and disabled, a profound statement about values in conditions where productivity might seem paramount to survival. In an environment that appears to demand that everyone pull their weight or perish, communities still cared for those who couldn't contribute directly to hunting or heavy labor. Elders provided knowledge and wisdom that couldn't be replaced, remembering rare events that younger people had never experienced, offering guidance based on decades of observation. Those with physical limitations could still contribute to camp tasks, child supervision that freed adults for other work, or tool maintenance and construction. The social contract recognized that everyone had value, that capability came in many forms, and that mutual care strengthened rather than weakened the group. Abandonment of the weak was not the norm, but the aberration, the failure of community that was remembered and condemned. James Aglukak, a community leader from Joa Haven, reflected on this during a gathering of elders and youth organized to bridge generations. People from outside sometimes assumed we were harsh, that we left the weak behind, like the wolves do when their pack is struggling. They didn't understand. They judged us by their own assumptions. Our strength came from taking care of each other, not from being ruthless. The old ones knew things that saved lives, which plants treated which illnesses, what weather signs meant, how to survive conditions we'd never seen before. The children were our future, the ones who'd carry knowledge forward. The injured today would hunt tomorrow if we kept them alive. We survived because we remained human, not because we became animals. Community wasn't weakness. It was the source of strength. Conflict resolution mechanisms prevented the kind of divisions and feuds that could fragment communities in environments where cooperation meant survival and division meant death. Disputes were addressed through mediation by respected elders, social pressure from the community that valued harmony, and sometimes temporary separation until tempers cooled and perspective returned. Violence within the community was rare and heavily sanctioned because it threatened everyone's survival, not just the individuals involved. A fight that killed or injured a hunter weakened the entire group's ability to obtain food. The social cost of disruption was too high to tolerate, so communities invested significant effort in preventing conflicts from escalating and resolving them when they occurred. Trade networks extended across vast distances, far greater than most people traveled personally, connecting coastal communities with inland groups, facilitating the exchange of seal oil for caribou hide, soapstone for tools, and lamps for obsidian that could be worked into cutting edges. Knowledge for knowledge as different groups shared innovations. These networks weren't just economic transactions calculated for material advantage. They were social bonds that created larger support structures, extending across territories, spread survival innovations across regions so that a technique developed in one area could benefit people hundreds of kilometers away, and maintained relationships that could be called upon in times of crisis. Trade gatherings served social functions beyond exchange, opportunities for marriages, sharing of stories and information, resolution of disputes between groups, and maintenance of the cultural connections that made people part of something larger than their immediate community. The wind still howls across the northern territories with the same ferocity it always has, indifferent to human presence or absence. The cold still bites with teeth that have never dulled, that care nothing for technology or knowledge. The darkness still swallows the land for months at a time, creating a world lit only by moon, stars, and aurora. But something has fundamentally changed in how people face these eternal realities. Modern technology has provided new tools, new materials, new capabilities that would have seemed miraculous to ancestors who survived with what they could make or find. But technology has also created distance from the accumulated wisdom that sustained human life in these conditions for thousands of years, knowledge that took countless generations to develop and can be lost in a single generation that decides it's no longer relevant. Climate change is altering the fundamental patterns that indigenous knowledge was built upon through millennia of observation. Ice forms later in the fall and melts earlier in the spring, shortening the season when traditional travel routes are passable. Animal migration routes shift as prey species respond to changing conditions, following food sources and temperature patterns that no longer match historical norms. Weather becomes less predictable, even for those trained from childhood to read its signs, as the rules that governed atmospheric behavior for centuries break down. Permafrost that remained frozen since the last ice age thaws, destabilizing ground that communities built on, changing drainage patterns, releasing methane that accelerates warming. Yet the fundamental principles, observation, adaptation, community cooperation, respect for the environment as a complex system, remain as relevant as ever, perhaps more so as modern systems show their fragility in the face of environmental instability they weren't designed to handle. Revival efforts are underway across northern communities, initiated by elders who recognize that crucial knowledge is dying with their generation, and young people who feel disconnected from their heritage and want to reclaim it. Programs teaching traditional skills to younger generations who grew up with YouTube and smartphones, who learned more from internet influencers than from grandparents. Language preservation initiatives, because so much knowledge is embedded in words that have no English equivalent, concepts that can only be fully understood in the language that evolved to describe them. Land-based learning programs where elders take youth onto the ice and into the wilderness, passing on skills that can't be learned from books or screens, that require hands-on experience and direct transmission from teacher to student. These programs face challenges: Funding, skepticism from those who see traditional knowledge as irrelevant to modern life, difficulty competing with the appeal of contemporary culture. But they persist, because the alternative is permanent loss. Emma, the seamstress from earlier, runs workshops in traditional garment construction, teaching skills her mother taught her to young people who've never touched caribou hide, who buy their parkas from Canadian Tire or order them online. I get skepticism at first. They wonder why they should learn to sew when they can buy clothes, but they feel something when they learn, when they work with the materials and see how it all fits together, like remembering something they never knew they forgot. One girl told me, "This isn't just about making clothes, is it? This is about understanding who we are." Exactly. It's about understanding who you are and where you come from. It's about knowing that you contain the strength of everyone who survived so you could be here. That's not primitive. That's powerful. The broader world is beginning to recognize what was nearly lost, though recognition comes too late for much knowledge that's already gone. Arctic research programs now consult with Indigenous knowledge holders because traditional observations about ice conditions, animal populations, and climate patterns provide data that scientific instruments miss: long-term trends, subtle changes, connections between phenomena that only become apparent through generations of observation. Survival training for military and scientific personnel incorporates indigenous techniques because modern gear still fails where traditional knowledge succeeds, because batteries die in extreme cold while human skill persists, because equipment can be lost or broken, but knowledge remains. But there's a tension in this recognition, a complexity that communities navigate carefully. Knowledge that was dismissed as primitive superstition when it threatened colonial control, when it represented an alternative to imposed ways of life, is now praised as traditional ecological knowledge when it serves scientific or commercial interests. Communities must decide what to share and what to protect, which knowledge is universal and which is sacred or sensitive, how to benefit from recognition without being exploited, how to maintain control over their own heritage. The conversation has shifted from, "You must abandon these old ways to teach us your secrets," but the power dynamics haven't changed as much as the rhetoric suggests. The stories contained in these chapters aren't museum exhibits to be viewed behind glass, artifacts of a vanished past, suitable only for anthropological curiosity and academic papers. They're not quaint traditions preserved for tourism or cultural festivals. They're proof of what humans can achieve when ingenuity meets necessity, when community overcomes individualism, when respect for the environment trumps domination of it, when knowledge accumulated across generations solves problems that innovation alone cannot. They're demonstrations that human beings are capable of far more resilience, adaptability, and intelligence than modern comfort has led us to believe. Sarah, the elder from Great Slave Lake, summarized it during a gathering where community members discussed how to preserve their heritage. "People ask me if the old ways are dying, if we're losing everything our ancestors knew. I tell them, knowledge doesn't die unless we let it, unless we decide it has no value. Every time someone learns to build an igloo, read ice, sew a parka with traditional stitching, that knowledge lives again. It doesn't have to be frozen in time, preserved exactly as it was. It adapts, changes, incorporates new materials and ideas, combines with new knowledge, but the core remains if we choose to maintain it. The cold teaches the same lessons it always has. The land speaks the same language. Whether we remember how to listen, whether we maintain the knowledge to survive and thrive, that's our choice. We're not helpless victims of history. We're inheritors of wisdom, and what we do with that inheritance matters. The temperature still drops to -45 and beyond. The wind still cuts through inadequate clothing like a knife through flesh. The darkness still lasts for months in the far north, creating a world of stars and aurora and endless night. And somewhere in the north, in communities scattered across the tundra and forests, someone is building a fire the way their grandmother taught them, reading clouds the way their grandfather did, sewing with stitches spaced exactly as generations refined them, surviving not through technology alone, but through knowledge earned across countless generations of facing the harshest conditions on Earth and refusing to surrender, refusing to accept that survival was impossible, instead learning how to thrive. That's not history locked in the past. That's the present continuing. And if we're wise enough to listen, to learn, to recognize that innovation doesn't always mean invention, but sometimes means remembering, it's the future too. A future where ancient wisdom and modern capability combine, where we take the best of both and create something stronger than either alone. A future where we remember that humans conquered impossible conditions not through domination, but through understanding. Not through force, but through knowledge. Not through individual heroism, but through community cooperation. The North remains unforgiving. It always will be. That's its nature. But humans learned to live there, to thrive there, to raise families and create culture and maintain communities across thousands of years in conditions that kill the unprepared in ours. That knowledge exists. It's not lost, not yet. Though some of it fades with every elder who dies without passing it on, with every young person who never learns because they were never taught. But what remains can be preserved, shared, adapted, and carried forward. The question isn't whether the knowledge works. Thousands of years proved that. The question is whether we value it enough to maintain it, whether we're wise enough to recognize that not all progress points forward, that sometimes the way forward requires looking back, listening to voices that understood truths we've forgotten. If you watched this far, it's because you liked this case, because something in these stories resonated with you. Leave a comment saying, "I watched this far, so I can get to know you and know who really likes the stories on this channel." Your engagement isn't just numbers. It's how I know these stories matter, how I know to create more like them. And if this story moved you, if it made you see human resilience differently, if it made you think about what we've lost and what we could reclaim, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to remember what our species is truly capable of. These stories matter. Your engagement ensures more people see them, ensures that knowledge isn't just acknowledged but celebrated, ensures that wisdom isn't dismissed as primitive but recognized as sophisticated. Don't just scroll past, act. Because knowledge preserved in videos and books and memories is better than knowledge lost forever. But knowledge practiced and lived and passed on, that's how cultures survive across millennia. That's how wisdom defeats forgetting.